Hello again, folks. This is the final video for this week on the final two readings for this week. And those readings are about strategy for emerging markets, a very important topic. Management of multinational enterprises typically pays most attention to developed markets, developed countries, for obvious reasons. Those markets are more active and probably more lucrative in most cases than underdeveloped or developing nations' markets might be. But for the long term, emerging or developing nations are where you just have to be if you want to have long-term growth. And most companies with enlightened strategy do seek long-term growth. So these two articles about strategy for emerging nations are really very important. And as always, I hope that you will be helped by this video, and that it'll help you not only appreciate some of the main points in forming strategy for emerging markets, but maybe do a little better on the quizzes for these two articles when you take it. And by the way, there is one quiz for these two articles on emerging markets. And so with that, maybe the best thing to do is get started talking about the articles. And let's see, the first one is 3.2. This is the second article in the syllabus for this course. This is the second article in the textbook. You may recall that the first article is an article on regional strategy by Gemawat. So this is article number 2, and after talking about it, we'll talk about number 3. And this article is by David Court and Laxman Narasimhan, and I hope I pronounced that right. Here we go. Some examples of emerging markets are on the left side of this slide. And one of the things that you probably have already noticed, because we've talked about it earlier in this course, and that is that China, although an emerging economy, happens to be larger when measured by purchasing power parity than the economy of the United States. So it's very big and growing faster than the US. So the difference between the size of China's economy and that of the US economy will get wider over time. Another rather interesting observation, again based on purchasing power parity, is that India's economy is more than twice the size of Russia's. Most people would not think of that if they didn't see these numbers, but there they are for your consideration. Now, one of the things that you may want to pay attention to is that there are regional trading blocks. We talked about them a little bit when we talked about Gemawat's article on regional strategy, but these regional trading blocks also are very important when we think about emerging nations. The ASEAN bloc, for instance, includes Indonesia. You can see it here. It's the, fifth largest economy. It includes several other countries in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand. It's a pretty significant growing group of countries. Mercosur, a group of countries in South America. Russia is the main country in what is left of the Soviet Union, but there are something like 12 or 14 countries in the community of independent states, so-called. And of course, the African Union with 55 countries is something all by itself. So, when we're talking about emerging nations, you also want to think about some of the regional blocks, trading blocks, where they exist. So these authors point out that it wasn't long ago that the United States was an emerging nation. And in fact, back in 1925, when the U.S. was an emerging nation, for 17 product categories, the market leader back then continued to be either the first or second ranked member of its industry all the way through the rest of the 20th century. So if you're the first company in an emerging nation to make a big difference, to really get established, chances are that first mover benefit is going to be realized for a very long time. Therefore, large multinational enterprises today want to become established in emerging nations in hope of getting first mover benefits and being able to exploit emerging nations' more rapid growth in the future. But there are problems. Very difficult to enter some of these countries because many of their governments prefer local participants. This is especially true in India, for instance. It's awfully difficult to break into India because the government protects its own. This is true in China as well. So it's one thing to say that it's very worthwhile strategic objective to break into these emerging nations and establish a stronghold in them. And it's another thing to actually do that. Another reason it's difficult sometimes is simply to recognize that culturally, economically, administratively, these nations are often much different than the economies and societies of the nations where multinational corporations are headquartered. By way of example, items that families just can't do without, such as food, transportation, shelter, perhaps healthcare, consume a lot higher portion of the family budget than in the US and other developed nations. And we'll see some more facts about that here in a little while. But just bear in mind that it's tough. I think the average income in India is somewhere in middle income, somewhere between $125 and $200 a month. So anyway, in emerging nations taken as a whole, we see that this table in the article. And what you can see is that the middle class, which is divided into three parts, upper, middle, and lower, but it represents the majority of consumer spending. We had 15%, 32 and 23. We come up, looks like, with 70%. And that's only 38% of the population. If you just about the same amount, 36 and a half if you leave out the upper middle. On the other hand, you can see that what the authors call the global, which is the upper class, with an average household income over $113,000, only 0.1% of the population, only 2% of all personal consumption expenditures or consumer spending. The deprived, the lower than middle class household income, less than 13,000 a year, and I can tell you that that in some of these countries, even that is considered to be pretty good. But that represents over 60% of the population and over a quarter of personal consumption. But it's very hard to reach these people because you know, they're really scratching a living out of the dirt. So what these authors are pointing out, and what the next article will point out, is that the preferred target is the middle class, even though it can be broken into three separate parts. And so how do we approach this industry, or this market rather? What kind of strategy might we have for them? And pardon me, let me switch to some new notes here just to keep myself on track. But at the very bottom of this slide, you can see that the authors have identified two determinants of consumers' ability to buy: affordability and accessibility. Now, affordability is pretty straightforward. Can the people afford it? At different grades, different levels of the middle class, you know, the folks are either more able or less able to buy things. But in addition, it's accessibility. It may be, for instance, that when people want to take their clothes to be washed to a laundry, that there isn't a laundry where the people live. Maybe it's difficult to get health care. So it may be that somehow companies have to bring those services to the people rather than the people going to the services. Don't forget, a large portion of the people in these countries don't have cars. They may not even have mopeds, but let's say they don't have cars. Then it's very difficult to go to the hospital or go to the grocery store or go to the pharmacy or go to the laundry because they have to walk. So accessibility of even non-discretionary goods, let alone discretionary goods, can be a real determinant of people's ability to buy things in emerging markets. And by the way, what we're talking about from here on is the middle class primarily. So the authors suggest that what you've got to do is develop clusters, find combinations or groups of people with combinations of demand and ability to buy. And so we have the ability to buy on the y-axis of this matrix. And on the x-axis, the needs of the consumer. And the needs will be of one of two types. And the needs really characterize the product, even more than the service, but the service as well. A service can be a product, of course, but they could be unique to the local, to the country, to the local setting. So in India, for instance, home remedies are a very local thing, and the government actually provides protection for companies that make home remedies out of products that are indigenous to India. Ethnic snacks would be the same way. The very inexpensive cars that are designed for the folks who have difficulty buying the kind of car that you and I probably drive. Is certain economy autos might be in that category. Now, there's another category of so-called consumer need, and they're really categories of products. And they're products that are the same worldwide. They're global in nature. It's not that the customer's need is global, and it's not that all the people around the world have the very same need for this thing, whatever it is. But the thing is the same worldwide, globally. So we have mobile phones, beer. Beer is beer, right? Pharmaceuticals and antibiotics and antibiotic. Motorcycles, appliances, personal banking, high-class automobiles, you know, BMWs, wherever it is. Or maybe I should have said maybe a premium auto like a Buick, but a luxury auto is probably a BMW. So, but I think you get the idea. So the so-called consumer need is maybe for a global product, for a product that is the same everywhere, whereas the need for a local product is a product that is unique to that particular geographic area, probably a country, but it could be a region. Here is the way that these authors have suggested that we characterize, that we define middle-class market segments in emerging nations. Okay, so once you've done that, it then is necessary to form a strategy for dealing with these different market segments. And you can read these and read about these in the article, but the one that's really interesting to me is the one in the lower left-hand corner. And where people don't have that much money to spend for the thing in question. And the thing in question is unique to the local market. Now, rather interestingly, if I were to go back here a moment, I would find appliances in the global category. A dishwasher's a dishwasher's a dishwasher. A refrigerator's a refrigerator's a refrigerator. But what if you have to be really well off to be in the upper middle class or even above that in order to buy a refrigerator? That could take in India somebody's annual salary. So maybe there's something down here. A local product that provides the same kind of benefits to most people as a refrigerator does. And in fact, there's an example of that in this article called the Chotocool. And it's essentially I don't know, I think we would call it a cooler that you would take on a picnic, only it's a great big thing. And it's got an electric fan. It runs on a battery. And it's, most importantly, it's portable, which is very useful to people in India, to middle-class people in India, because those people live in apartments, small apartments, and they move often from these apartments. So you can't throw a refrigerator on your back and take it to the next apartment down the road wherever you're moving, but you can take this Choto Cool. So it's inexpensive, it's affordable, it's not expensive to operate. It's got, and it does what it's needed to do, which is cool beverages and leftovers, so you can eat them a second time rather than throw them away. If you don't keep them cool, of course, they'll spoil. So really serves the needs of people. And so there are other examples, micro-marketing, selling things. There was one article in an earlier edition of this textbook where Vicks VapoRub, the president decided to sell the product in these very small containers, sometimes foil containers, sometimes little containers, rather than the big packages that, larger packages that people bought Vicks VapoRub in. And pardon me, it turned out that Vicks VapoRub was made from ingredients, all of which are obtainable within India, and they got special dispensation to call it one of these home remedies that was made from local products, and they got the Indian government to give them special permissions, and they, as a result, were able to grow very rapidly. But the nano car offered by Tata, an Indian automotive company, is another example. But this Choto Cool is one of my favorite examples. The other market segments have to be dealt with in special ways as well. And I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna let you read about these. Here are a few comments on trading blocks. An example here is the ASEAN trading bloc. I think the point is that Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, probably not Brunei, are emerging nations. Here are trading blocks. Whoops, it looks like I missed one. And I made a mistake here too, because this is the CIS. It's not the ASEAN. It looks like I copied this thing and did not. There we go. Okay, but a number of the countries in this trading bloc, including Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Moldova. These are all, I don't think Moldova is even emerging, but the others are. So the trading blocs, were very important in Gimawatt's article, and now here they are again. Again, you can just look at these countries and you can see that trading blocs very often include developing nations. They sure do in the African Union, but only Mexico and NAFTA. So with that, I think we've actually covered enough to give you the idea that the middle class isn't exactly the same in emerging markets as it is in more developed markets. And although they're emerging, they're not, the people in them aren't at the lowest income levels or the highest, they're in the middle. But what they can afford as middle income families and individuals is a whole lot different than what people can afford in the United States and Europe. Nevertheless, they're growing, and emerging nations' economies are growing. So multinational enterprises have to form a strategy that is suited to these markets. And that takes a lot of innovation. For instance, in coming up with a completely different kind of a product than would have been the case in a more developed market. be sure to pay attention in this article. Let me see if I can just pick up on this to be real sure. Or have we done it? No, we haven't gotten, that's the problem. We haven't gotten to the second article here. I was about to stop the video. So what I want to do now is close this slide out and bring up the new set of slides, which frankly is fairly brief. Had kind of a mental lapse there. Okay, so here's the third article, and it is about doing business with new business models. And we talked about some in that last article when we talked about developing different strategies for different market segments. This article by Eyring, Johnson, and Nair is simply going to pursue this matter a little further, and I doubt that it'll take us too long to go through it. The authors point out that multinational enterprises expect 70% of their growth from emerging economies. 40% of that 70 is from China and India alone. But as I pointed out in talking about the last article, it's easier said than done. It can be quite difficult to break into India and China, for instance. To make matters worse, a lot of multinational enterprises, because among other things, they haven't had a course like this one, their managers will import the products and the business models, the way of doing business that they have at home. Therefore, they appeal mainly to the upper income category, that segment that isn't even in the middle income, and therefore they don't do a lot of business because they're not appealing to that middle class. And so a better approach clearly is to aim at the middle class. And I remind you here on this slide, a good idea is to take a look at that article by Court and Narasimhan, because that gives you more insight into just how the middle class is constructed in emerging markets. So these guys give you an approach to forming a strategy, a marketing strategy. Study what the customer actually does. Just think about that Chatacool again. You know, what are they doing with their refrigerator? They're not doing the kind of things that you and I are doing. There's not a cold water dispenser in the door, for instance. They don't have an ice cube in a freezer section. They're just cooling beverages and leftovers. So you have to consider alternatives. And of course, in that example, was quite an alternative. But you just don't think about other products in this category, in this industry, like other refrigerators, but rather a whole different approach may be needed. So you have to discover consumers' unmet needs and what they do to get those needs met. In the case of laundries, for instance, they go down to the river and wash their clothes in the river. They may even take their clothes to somebody else who washes their clothes in the river for them. But the river's dirty, has stuff in it, you know, microbes and bacteria and what have you. It takes a long time. Maybe there's a better way. And in this article, in fact, they talk about a new kind of a laundry service. So the idea is to uncover the root cause. Just what is the customer trying to do with a product, such as cool beverages and leftovers, and to accomplish with their competing behavior. So with that, the authors of this article suggest that there are 4 elements of a business model, that is a way of doing business. One, you have to be able to offer the customer something that's worthwhile, worth paying for, a value proposition. Second, you have to have a profit formula. That is to say, you have to add up all the costs and see whether the price that you can charge for this product is going to exceed it. You have to have the key processes. You have to lay them out step by step. Otherwise, you can't come up with a cost. And the same is true of resources. What raw materials, what intellectual resources will be necessary, as well as tangible permanent resources. And then the authors do something rather interesting, and they have a diagram in the article to explain it a little better. But once you have the value proposition, the way you approach these four elements differs depending upon whether you're trying to gain competitive advantage from differentiation, that is pointing out to people that your product is better, offers better features, more value, which is worth paying more for, as opposed to low cost, which is self-explanatory. You know, people can't afford what's being offered now. You're going to offer pretty much the same kind of thing, but at a much lower cost. If you're going to do differentiation, the authors say what you first have to do is figure out what kind of resources are going to enable you to make this better product. Then develop, line out, spell out the processes using those resources and what they'll cost. And once you've done that, then you come up with your profit formula. Based on these costs, I've got to charge this price. And then you ask yourself, can the people afford that? And if not, you do it over and keep doing it till you get it right. But if you're going at things from a low cost point of view, you're basically asking the question, what do the people in the market segment that I'm targeting, what are they willing to pay? What can they afford? And so you start out with that. You start out by saying, here's the price that I've got to offer this thing at, and therefore I've got to produce it at this cost. Some cost that's lower than what people will pay so I can make a profit. And so we start out with the price cost formula first, then the required process. In order to get that cost low, I've got to be able to do these things at a certain cost. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to have materials that will, when I put them into this process, are not going to push the total cost up over. And maybe in order to do a certain kind of a process, you've got to have a particular kind of material, and you're going to have to search around looking for a material that is low enough in cost so that you can do this process, make this product, and stay within your budget. So two completely different approaches to a business model, depending on whether you're trying to beat the competition with value, differentiation, or beat the competition with a lower price, which is a low cost model. Okay. So the authors suggest focusing in on the middle class. It's between the very highest and the very lowest. But you got to bear in mind that the middle class isn't the middle class that you and I know. In India, the typical monthly income is between $125 and $200 a month. That wouldn't be considered middle income in the United States, but it is in India. People live typically in a one-room apartment, and they relocate frequently, so they can't carry the refrigerator around on their back. So to reach that middle class, you've got to reinvent the business model. You've got to identify the unmet need, develop a model for meeting that need at an acceptable price, and then implement it. and do experiments, one after the other. Try a thing, try another thing until you think you really got it right. Then you can invest in more assets. And the authors really recommend what I just said, frequent low-cost experiments. And as you can see, they kind of favor the low-cost approach, the low-cost objective, for obvious reasons. Okay, so the example of Hawala. Now, Hawala is the process, the folks who come here from Mexico to make money to send home because they may not be in the country legally. They go to a place, a store, a business where they have a friend, and the friend has a bank account, and the friend can wire money to someone else in Mexico who is a friend of the family. And so the money is transferred strictly on the basis of trust. And Vodafone came up with a method of doing that in Kenya that was legal and that had more security, that there was less risk for the people who used the money transfer process by using that technique. Tata's Nano car is a very small little car, and Tata had to figure out how to make a car with a much simpler manufacturing operation, nothing like a regular automotive manufacturing facility or factory in the US or Europe, but a much smaller, simpler assembly operation to make the nano car. And then we have the ChatoCool that we've already talked about. Its purpose was to keep leftovers and beverages cool for a short time. Most of what's in a Western refrigerator wasn't needed, so they developed this inexpensive portable cooler that runs on a battery. There's a picture of it in the article. And the benefit, of course, was that it was affordable because lots of the unneeded features were no longer in this thing, and it could be manufactured in a very inexpensive way. And it enabled people to have all the functions that they needed. Now, you may recall that there are two dimensions of the ability to buy. One is affordability, but the other is access. And I've mentioned laundry services more than once in this video. And in your article, pardon me, there's a description of the village laundry service. And the folks who came up with this laundry service, consultants, took a look at all the laundry service in India, hiring people to go down to the river and wash their clothes in the dirty water, or doing it themselves. But there just had to be a better way. But people couldn't just drive down to the local laundromat or even to the local laundry because there weren't any. So the access to laundry service was a big problem. And so they came up with kiosks that were mobile. They were on wheels. I don't know, think of the porta potty, in the United States, things movable. And so they carried these kiosks to different neighborhoods where they would have washing machines and dryers. And therefore the service was convenient to the people because it was offered local. It was a lot faster. It takes time to go down to the river or have somebody do it. You got to get there. Then you got to take your time doing all this stuff and then come home. And the people who wash clothes for other people may offer 2 or 3 or 4 day service, and water's dirty, Here you've got good laundry service, and you can have same day service, and it's less expensive, and it's more sanitary, takes the service to the customer. The high overhead cost, and it would be the overhead cost of having a standalone laundromat or a standalone laundry in India is prohibitive. The overhead cost would be. And a laundry isn't considered a very expensive business in the United States. We have lots of them in neighborhoods all over the United States. That's an expensive capital investment in India. So better than locating a building, building a building to put a laundry in, they put the laundry apparatus in a kiosk and carry the thing around to neighborhoods. It's brilliant. That's Village Laundry Service, and it's a great illustration of access, bringing the service to the people rather than having to asking the people to come to the service. And so that concludes our little discussion of developing a new business model for the middle class market in emerging economies. Fascinating little article. I hope you enjoyed this summary of it. I hope it helps you to appreciate the main points and read this article more easily and get a better grade on your quiz. Definitely do read these two articles about emerging markets. I've covered the main points as best I could, so you can read it faster now, but read the article so you get everything out of it, and you'll do great on the quiz. And with that, I will say goodbye to you so that you are able to open the book and start reading. Bye.